This presentation examines how stereotypes have been portrayed in Hollywood films and how those portrayals have changed over time. My project connects the discrimination discussed in The Broken Commandment with stereotypes in cinema, especially the way minority groups have been misrepresented. I will compare an older Hollywood film, Breakfast at Tiffany's from 1961, with a more modern film, Crazy Rich Asians, to show how representation has changed. The purpose of this presentation is to analyze not only what stereotypes appear, but also why they were created and what effects they have on society. Stereotypes are oversimplified, generalized beliefs about particular groups of people. They reduce complex individuals to a set of assumed characteristics, often leading to prejudice and discrimination in society. The Burakumin were a marginalized group in Japan's rigid Edo period social hierarchy. Forced into occupations considered impure, they faced severe social exclusion and stigma that persisted for centuries. Published in 1906, The Broken Commandment by Shimizaki Toson is a seminal work exploring Burakumin discrimination in Japan. The novel examines themes of social stigma, hidden identity, and historical prejudice that marginalized communities faced. Ushimatsu is the protagonist of The Broken Commandment and comes from the Burakumin social group, which faced discrimination in Japanese society. Because of this prejudice, he is forced to hide his true identity in order to avoid rejection and social exclusion. Throughout the story, Ushimatsu struggles with fear of being discovered and rejected by others. This creates a strong internal conflict, showing the psychological impact that discrimination can have on a person's life. The discrimination in the broken commandment can be connected to the stereotypes shown in films because both involve reducing people to narrow, harmful ideas. In literature, Ushimatsu is judged because of inherited social stigma. In film, minority characters are often judged and portrayed according to cultural stereotypes rather than reality. Hollywood has historically simplified cultures and identities in order to make characters easier to understand for mainstream audiences, but this simplification often becomes prejudice. In that way, film stereotypes can function much like social discrimination. They misrepresent people, reinforce power imbalances, and encourage audiences to see minority groups as different, strange, or inferior. The older film I chose is Breakfast at Tiffany's, released in 1961. This film is famous for its style, romance, and Audrey Hepburn's performance, but it is also well known for its offensive portrayal of a Japanese character, Mr. Yunioshi. This example is useful for my project because it clearly shows how Hollywood in the 1960s often treated Asian identity as a joke. Even though the movie is celebrated in many ways, it reflects the racist attitudes that were common in the entertainment industry at the time. Looking at this film helps us understand how stereotypes were normalized in mainstream culture. Mr. Yunioshi is the Japanese landlord in Breakfast at Tiffany's, and he is portrayed in highly exaggerated and offensive way. If instead of being treated as a realistic character, he is used mainly for comedy. His role is not to contribute emotional depth or cultural perspective to the story, but to make the audience laugh at him. This is important because it shows how minority characters were often denied dignity in older Hollywood films. Rather than being represented as ordinary people with full personalities, they were turned into caricatures. In this case, Japanese identity is presented as something strange and ridiculous. The portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi includes several offensive stereotypes. He is shown with thick glasses, exaggerated buck teeth, an unnatural accent, and loud, awkward behavior. These features are not meant to be meant to reflect a real Japanese person. They are designed to create a comic stereotype. The performance turns physical appearance, language, and cultural identity into objects of ridicule. This is especially harmful because it encouraged audiences to associate Japanese people with these false and insulting images. The character is not presented with dignity, individuality, or realism. Instead, he becomes an example of how Hollywood used racial caricature for entertainment. These stereotypes appeared for several reasons. First, Hollywood in the 1960s had very little diversity, both on screen and behind the camera. There were few Asian actors in major roles, and there was little concern for authentic representation. Second, American society at the time still contained strong racist attitudes, and those attitudes influenced the film industry. Third, stereotypes were often used because filmmakers thought they were funny or because they made minority characters seem exotic to mainstream audiences. In other words, these portraits were not accidental. They were produced by an industry that valued entertainment and familiarity over accuracy and respect. For the contemporary comparison, I chose Crazy Rich Asians. This film is important because it represents a major shift in Hollywood's portrayal of Asian characters. Unlike older films that relied on caricature, this movie features a predominantly Asian cast and centers Asian characters as the main focus of the story. The film presents them as complex individuals with different personalities, desires, conflicts, and social roles. It does not use their ethnicity as a joke. Instead, it treats their cultural background as part of a rich and meaningful story. This makes it a strong contrast to Breakfast at Tiffany's. One major difference in modern film is that Asian characters are no longer limited to side roles or stereotypes. In Crazy Rich Asians, Asian actors play the main characters, and they are portrayed with emotional depth and individuality. They are allowed to be romantic, intelligent, vulnerable, ambitious, and flawed, just like any other human characters. This is significant because representation is not only about appearing on screen, but about being portrayed as fully human. Modern films like this one show that audiences are ready for more authentic and diverse stories, and that Hollywood can be beyond narrow stereotypes. Another strength of Crazy Rich Asians is that the way it presents cultural identity. The film includes family traditions, respect for elders, social expectations, and questions of heritage and belonging. These cultural elements are shown as meaningful parts of the characters' lives, not as jokes or strange habits. This is a major contrast with older Hollywood films where Asian culture was often mocked or simplified. In this modern film, culture is treated with seriousness and complexity. It becomes part of story's emotional depth and helps the audience better understand the characters' choices and relationships. The biggest differences between older and contemporary films can be seen in how characters are presented. In older films like Breakfast at Tiffany's, Asian identity was exaggerated through fake accents, distorted physical features, and comic behavior. In modern films like Crazy Rich Asians, characters speak naturally, look realistic, and are given depth and dignity. The goal is no longer to mock them, but to tell a meaningful stories about their lives. This change shows progress in both the film industry and society. It suggests a greater awareness of how harmful stereotypes can be and why respectful representation matters. Hollywood has changed over time because audiences, critics, and filmmakers have become more aware of the harm caused by stereotypes. There is now more pressure on studios to cast diverse actors and represent cultures more accurately. Global audiences have also influenced this change since films are no longer made only for one narrow audience. In addition, conversations about racism, representation, and inclusion have become more visible in public culture. Although problems still remain, the industry today is more likely to face criticism when it uses offensive stereotypes. This has encouraged more thoughtful and respectful storytelling. Comparing these two films show a clear shift in representation. In Breakfast at Tiffany's, the Asian character is reduced to a joke and exists mainly for mockery. He has little depth, little dignity, and no serious purposes in the story. In Crazy Rich Asians, Asian characters are central to the narrative and are portrayed as complex people with real emotions and relationships. The older film reinforces stereotypes while the modern film challenges them. This comparison helps show how Hollywood has moved from caricature toward more authentic representation, even though that progress is still incomplete. Stereotypes have serious effects beyond the screen. They reinforce prejudice by teaching audiences to associate certain groups with false and negative traits. They also misrepresent cultures by reducing them to a few simplistic ideas. For viewers who have little real life contact with a group, film stereotypes may shape their entire understanding of that group. This can contribute to discrimination, exclusion, and social inequality. Stereotypes also affect the people being represented because seeing one's culture mocked or distorted can be painful and damaging. For these reasons, stereotypes are not harmless entertainment, they have real social consequences. Accurate representation is important because media influences how people think about themselves and others. When films portray groups respectfully and realistically, they can promote empathy, understanding, and cultural awareness. Good representation also allows people from marginalized communities to see themselves as full participants in society rather than as stereotypes. In addition, diverse representation improves storytelling by bringing in new perspectives and experiences. Films becomes richer and more meaningful when it includes many voices. This is why representation matters not only for minority communities but for society as a whole. In conclusion, this project shows that stereotypes were deeply embedded in older Hollywood films and often reflected broader systems of prejudice. The example of Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's demonstrates how Asian identity was once distorted for humor and mockery. By contrast, Crazy Rich Asians shows a more respectful and complex portrayal of Asian characters and culture. Connecting these films to the Broken Commandment helps us see that stereotypes and discrimination are related forms of social injustice. Both reduce people to labels and deny them dignity. Although representation has improved, it remains important to continue questioning how films portray different communities. This final slide lists the main sources used in the project. These include The Broken Commandment by Shimizaki Toson, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Crazy Rich Asians, and course materials on stereotypes and representation. Including references is important because it shows that the analysis is based on real text and films rather than only personal opinion. It strengthens the academic quality of the presentation and gives credit to the original sources. Thanks for listening.